Okay, so we're going to get started now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the February program for the Association of Fraternity Sorority Advisors Virtual Based Classroom Series, AdvanceU. Due to the generous support of Zeta Alpha, AdvanceU is designed to enhance the alignment of the fraternity sorority experience with the changing dynamics of higher education. The goal is to provide programs each month that range from new skill development to application of new concepts through exploring a wide variety of topics in higher education and work with fraternities and sororities. Today's program is FIPG, Risk Management is Everyone's Responsibility. Those letters, FIPG, are now perhaps the most recognizable in the entire Greek world. For 30 years, the Fraternal Information and Programming Group has been the voice for risk management policies and practices. Many colleges, universities, interfraternity, and Panhellenic councils across the country have adopted the FIPG policy as their own, providing a level playing field for all Greek organizations on their campus. But if we didn't have FIPG, where would we be? This program will review the history of the organization, the development of policies, and highlight the most recent changes in structure and guidelines. My name is Becky Gleason, and I serve as the Director of Education and Curriculum Design at Zeta Alpha, and also on the AdvanceU Committee. I have the privilege of serving as moderator for today's program. So before we begin, I would like to go over just a few logistics of today's program. If you are hearing me now, then you already know how to connect to the audio for GoToWebinar. Just note, the registration confirmation email you received included audio options for both the computer speakers and telephone. So if you experience any system issues, we encourage you to use the second option. In the main area of your computer screen, you should see today's presentation slides, and then in the upper right corner, you should have the GoToWebinar control panel. In this panel, you can submit questions to us at any point during today's program. While some might be addressed throughout, we do have time reserved at the end specifically for questions and answers. Feel free to use this at any point, but if you have any technical issues, put those in the question panel as well so we can address them. More specific technical issues can be handled with GoToWebinar Support Center at 866-926-6492. Also note that we will be tracking the AdvanceU hashtag on Twitter, so we encourage you to share what you have learned through this tool. We will now begin today's program. We're so happy to have Dave Westall of Limberlost Consulting doing this program today. Dave will cover his background during his presentation, so without further ado, I would like to turn things over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Becky. And just if you do have technical difficulties, as Becky reviewed, these are the things you can do. It's a privilege to be with everyone today. My name is Dave Westall. My background includes 9 years as an assistant prosecuting attorney in Michigan, 18 as chief executive of my nationals fraternity, and 10 years now as a consultant working with over 30 men's and women's national organizations and many universities and campuses. I've also had the privilege of serving as Director of Policy Interpretation for FIPG since 1995. That's a lot of questions over the years that I've received, and we'll cover some of those, but let's start with these. Let me tell you again how pleased I am, and I consider it a privilege as well, using Becky's word, to be part of AFA and to take part in today's presentation. This is it's fun for me. Let's begin with the starting point of FIPG. In 1987, it comes as a shock to some people, there were no rules. Risk management was a concept. It wasn't really a reality. A lawsuit out of a university in the southwest part of the United States concluded with a structured settlement of $24.1 million awarded to the victim, the plaintiff in this case, who was a young man who was reduced to the mental and physical status of about a 9-year-old, according to the court pleadings, and that money was set aside to compensate him for the rest of his life. And that was something that a lot of people that got their attention, because for $24 million, I often ask my audiences today, would you give up who you are for that much money? I've never had anyone put a hand in the air. And I said, well, that's right, but the thing about this case was the fraternity involved was quite nearly bankrupted. They had to move their headquarters. They had to go into a very, very survival mentality, if you will, and it took them years to recover financially because the insurance didn't cover all of the expense. So that got the attention. 11 men's fraternities then decided we need to see if we can pool our resources, purchase liability insurance. They go out into the general market. There aren't many companies that are selling insurance. Those that did said, we've looked at your claims record, and the men's fraternities at that time, women always enjoy this, the men's fraternities were the 6th worst risk in the insurance industry. It was safer to be a nuclear waste disposal company than it was to operate a men's national fraternity. So that was the reality. And the insurance companies that were willing to consider selling to men's fraternities said, you have to change the way you do things. So the fraternities, not all of the 11 actually ended up joining, and not all of them have remained members or did remain members of FIPG, but what they did was form the Fraternity Insurance Purchasing Group. As I know, they're pretty clever, and that was the genesis of the policy that has been so significant to us. We had to have a policy. So as people put that together, the idea was, let's develop a better way, a safer way to operate. The policy was drafted and approved. If you'll read the policy, it really addresses key liability points, and it was written from the perspective, and I hasten to add this, not to protect the national organization. If you are part of a national organization staff, if you're a volunteer, you know that in nearly every lawsuit, the national organization will be named. That's just a given. That's going to happen. There's no way you can protect yourself from that. This was written, the policy was, to help our undergraduates have a safer experience. And if you read the way the policy is written, it is designed to reduce the key areas of liability, and there are 3. The first one is the size of events and the definition, actually, what is an event, the number of organizations involved, and if you have alcohol, if alcohol is involved in any way, and you have a minimum number of people. Some organizations use that, others use the standby of if it looks like an event associated with your organization, that's how it's going to be construed. The reason for that is that's exactly what plaintiffs' attorneys do when they file suit. They're going to work very, very hard to show that it was a chapter event. So FIPG, the policy itself, does not specify how many people, but many national organizations do. When I was exec, I told our men, if you have 6 or more men, it's going to be an event associated with our fraternity. I don't care what you call it. I don't care how casual it is. I don't care how spontaneous it is. If there's alcohol involved, you got 6 or more, it's going to be an event because the plaintiff is going to do that so they can go after our insurance coverage. That's the reality. And the number of organizations, as we'll get to in a few moments, there's no restriction, but FIPG within the manual has over the years said 4 is the maximum number of organizations, usually 2 men's, 2 women's. But that also addresses the gigantic all Greekers, as you might call them, things like that. That gives them a basis for saying, nope, we're not going to do that. All designed to say to our undergraduates, if you have alcohol and there's some people involved, that will be construed as an event and you need to follow the policy. That's why that trigger mechanism is in there. The number of people also factors in. Most national organizations have established a policy of 2 or 3 guests per member. That's what FIPG recommends, and that was the original concept of let's keep these to a reasonable size. If not, you could have 5,000 of your closest friends over In practical terms, you're not going to be able to control that. You will not be able to, there's no way a group of 60 or 80 or 200 can control that many people. The second aspect with an event is how many people can access. And the clear signal through FIPG is any event with alcohol has to have a guest list. You have to have, and the specifics on that are 24 hours in advance. The policy, the host chapter has to have a guest list. That is not a sign-in sheet. That's not, oh, my cousin showed up from New York. He wants to come in. Nope, not unless his name is on the list. A sign-in sheet, a guest list is not a roster. Common practice on a lot of campuses these days, the women's groups provide a roster to the men's group hosting the event. That's not a guest list. While the names may be some of the people may be there, what you really want to know is exactly who is going to attend. The way I explain that to the undergraduates is, if you were having your wedding, would you want anyone able to access your reception? Wedding crashes, i.e., and they go, well, no. And I said, that's right. It's not your obligation, your responsibility to have an event for the entire campus. You want to restrict attendance to those people you know. That's implicit in the process. And therefore, the idea is if we do that, we're going to have a safer event, because over the years, the insurance carriers are much less likely to share this information, but in years gone by, about 30% of the claims against men's fraternities resulted from what activity at social events, and it's fights. And it is rarely a fight between two members of the same organization or between two host organizations. It's almost always between a member and somebody who somehow gained access to the event. And it doesn't matter if they were crude, rude, belligerent, or just being a jerk. If it was a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. What matters is when you start throwing hands, people get hurt, and that's going to result in claims. And the first question I always had as an exec was, show me the guest list. And of course they'd say, well, and I say, okay, welcome to probation. But in addition, do you see why we have that requirement in place? If you have a guest list, these people stay outside. They never gain access. So that helps too, along with the definition of event. Notice as well how the authors of the policy place emphasis upon the event as opposed to the venue. So our undergraduates will say, well, it wasn't at the house, it was at a satellite house, or it wasn't at the annex. Doesn't matter. An event is an event, and that's how the policy follows through. It doesn't have to be, if you do have a chapter house, and some groups don't, but if you do, it doesn't have to be at the house. Third, the policy also addressed every possible way that chapters could purchase, and I will add, provide alcohol, all of which is dangerous. If you put alcohol in someone else's tummy, you share some responsibility for what happens to that person. That's just a basic 10A of the law. And of course, we often see where undergraduates attend an event, they're provided with alcohol, and then they go out and something bad happens to them. They fall from roofs, they fall out of windows. They are the victims of sexual assault. They're the victims of a fight. They're the victims of being jumped, if you will, or robbed. And all of those go back to what effect the alcohol had on them, and then from there, who gave them that alcohol. So FIPG, long ago, part of the original policy was any event with alcohol has to be BYOB, bring your own beer, or third-party vendor. Third-party vendor being a professional bartender, if you will, someone who sells drinks over the bar at the going rate in that particular community. For BYOB, beer or wine. I'm often asked, Dave, what is the biggest difference between when I was an undergraduate at Michigan State, and I say, yeah, that was just a couple years ago, and today's student? And I say, in my day, we drank to socialize, but in today's environment, some, not all, but some of our men and women drink to get drunk, and they use liquor. if you sat me down and said, what change would you like to make? Well, I see some communities going to this. They're at least saying it has to be beer or wine. And I don't recall anyone ever dying from drinking too much beer. Your body simply won't accept that. On the other hand, we have deaths every year from drinking too much liquor, and specifically vodka. It seems to be the drink of choice. And it's terrifying how many ambulance runs, how many transports, as they're referred to, occur, and it's almost always with liquor. So the concept of FIPG was, if we can reduce the amount of alcohol that people are taking in, and we don't put the chapter or members acting on behalf of the chapter in a position where they're providing alcohol or selling it or bartering it or giving it away, we're going to have a much safer event. And you and I know that that's not followed, certainly not universally. Once in a while I encounter a group that does a pretty good job with it. Not all national organizations are in congruence with BYOB, but it is a safer way to do things because it restricts the amount of alcohol you take in to what you brought in and how much you're drinking. And that makes, generally speaking, for a safer environment. We all know that many of our students come to us as freshmen, as first-year students. They've been drinking for years, so this is nothing new for them. But to be able to restrict the amount of alcohol and not place the chapter in a place where they are providing it, that's big. And that was the purpose of the FIPG. So that's why a policy, so that's why it says may not act on behalf of, may not provide, may not co-sponsor. All those things run to the concept of we're not putting alcohol into somebody else's tummy. As I noted, the caveat, the FIPG has never served as a protection against litigation. We're trying to help our undergraduates have enjoy themselves, but in a safe way. And that's our ultimate goal. At the end of the night, it really doesn't matter to me so much as did they follow policy to the letter, is did they have a safe event? Were people able to go home? Nobody had a bad experience. We didn't have any major issues. That to me is a W. That's a win. And remember that there were no rules before 1987. There was no policy in place. That's why FIPG, I think, was received and why it has developed. As after the original group, and by the way, some trivia, FIPG never actually purchased liability insurance. It never did. I still, as Director of Policy and TERP, I still get calls, even in 2017, from usually smaller groups or local groups saying, yeah, we want to buy insurance. And I say, that's good, smart move, but FIPG does not provide that. It never did. By the time the policy had been hammered out and the groups had decided what they were going to do, some other groups got together and said, we need to expand and take another look at this. FIPG never served for that purpose, but it was a standalone association with a policy, and then it began referring to itself as a risk management consortium, and that's how it stayed right up to 2016. So if you were going to follow the policy, then you joined FIPG. You paid a very modest fee each year, I think $250, and you had a seat, and you got to meet once a year and voice your opinion. As the policy evolved, it expanded from alcohol into things like firearms, sexist or misogynistic behavior, fire safety, always a concern, drug usage. FIPG also advanced when it finally came, the board of directors said, why do we call ourselves purchasing insurance? Because we're not doing that. So it became the Fraternal Information and Programming Group. That was very intentional, by the way. No one wanted to change FIPG. It had already become a hated symbol in some cases. And the idea was, let's make sure that we want to preserve that acronym, so let's come up with words to fit. And that's what they did. So Fraternal Information and Programming Group, and that's exactly what it evolved into. Most national organizations either use FIPG as a base or a similar policy. And as the policy was promoted as we entered the internet age and it became accessible to people, then many undergraduates, councils, and universities, in fact, and colleges have adopted it as, at least in part, what they see as the policy for their campus. And indeed, I was on a campus recently doing consulting and sat down with the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs, who walked me through their policy contrasted with FIPG and then asked me for input. And this was a policy for all of their RSOs, as they're known, their registered student organizations. So the same policy that we use with fraternities and sororities also applies to all other organizations. And he told me this is what we've been using. It makes sense for us, and it's easily understandable. And he said those are all things that we think are important. By 2012, we had advanced and over 50 women's and men's national organizations, including the North American Interfraternity Conference and NAPA. We had a board of directors, did FIPG. We had dues. They made yearly donations for different causes, all risk management oriented. And the idea was that it would continue to serve as a consortium. So if you joined as a national organization, you were saying, we will, at the minimum, follow the FIPG, as it was known then, the policy, at the minimum. By 2013, the board met every year in November, and we had some longtime board members, Larry Stanton-Weiss, the Executive Director of Kappa Alpha Order, Wynn Smiley from Alpha Tau Omega, several others, Cynthia Menges from Delta Zeta, and they had been on the board for a number of years. And the discussions at the board meetings began to take on a tone of, are we really accomplishing something by maintaining this as a standalone association? And the answer, the rhetorical answer was, we're not sure. We have a good policy. We like that. We're getting the word out. We like that. We're providing a resource. We like that. Do we really need to have a standalone association to do that? And that was the question. And then the answer eventually came back, can we accomplish this work through some other means? And there was some discussion about what that would look like. They were excellent discussions. No one was rushing to judgment, as the saying goes, but it was, do we really need this? By the way, particularly in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the FIPG board of directors served as, if you will, a segue or a platform for people to serve, to go to the Fraternity Executives Association board of directors. There was a pathway, if you will, and I followed that along with a number of other people. We'd serve on the board for FIPG, and then with that experience, you have maybe 5, 6, 7 years, then you would be in a good position to serve on the FEA board, which is, of course, composed of executive directors. So was the FIPG board. That was all executive directors. In November of 2015, the decision was made. We don't need a standalone association. So, and among other things, FIPG policy will then segue into guidelines. And there were several reasons for that, but we had, not going to name them, but I will tell you that we had 2, perhaps 3 executive directors who were becoming increasingly concerned about the use of the term policy as that related to litigation. And they felt that if their organizations were members of FIPG, and if FIPG used the term policy, that made life more difficult for them if they were to be sued. Policy implies that someone's going to do what they say they're going to do. People like me would ask rhetorical questions such as, are you sure that this is not just a reaction to a particularly aggressive attorney? But regardless, the concerns were there, and that was a factor. But also, do we need to spend the time? Do we need to spend the money? Do we need to keep doing what we're doing if we're not really accomplishing much in terms of change? It's just finalizing and adding details and so forth. So that was the thought behind it. And I was administrator of FIPG as well, and I was told, Dave, we want to undertake this journey to become something other than what we are. And that would mean that we would eliminate the membership by the national organizations. We wouldn't have meetings or bylaws. And I knew this from law school, but it takes time to wind up the affairs of a nonprofit. There are a lot of hills and curves. And the decision was made, we'll approach the Fraternity Executives Association, see if they're willing to take this on as a committee. The FEA board said, yes, we will. But it took us just about a year with the help of a very able attorney here from Indianapolis to get through the entire process. And it requires publication of your intent. That's to make sure that there are no debtors out there who might come forward and say, hey, you closed down before we could collect the money. There were none, but you have to do that by the law and so forth. So it took a while, and there are some tax consequences and so forth. But we worked through all those, and in October of 2016, FIPG is now a resource of the Fraternity Executives Association, and it now serves as a committee for the FEA. Final meeting was held. We took a vote in the summer of 2016 by the members to make sure we were good, and they all agreed, yes, we're going to what's sometimes referred to as sunset history or sunset legislation, meaning the sun is setting and we're going to shut this down. And everyone agreed that was what we wanted to do. And then we had a committee set up, and we would carry over the policy, only now it would be called guidelines. And even though it's been a resource before, that point would be emphasized even more so via the FEA website, that anyone who wanted to use or wants to use FIPG guidelines is welcome to do so. It doesn't matter what level, you don't have to get permission, fire away. And it will also give us some other opportunities, as we'll see. All may access, all may implement, all may benefit. And that makes it, I think that's a good thing. That's going to help all of our undergraduates particularly, but also alumni and alumni, corporations, so many of our new emerging cultural groups that are working their way through the same decisions as some that your organization and mine, if you're from an NIC or NPC group, we may have made these same choices 100 years ago. As I tell I've worked with 9 Latina national sororities, and I often tell them, you're doing the same things we did 100 years ago and going through the same dynamics. So with that in mind, this really helps those groups. They can look at this, they can say, yeah, we like this portion, we don't really want to use this one, fine. You don't have to be a member, you can just access it and you can benefit from it. So we're now a committee, men's and women's executives. Nikki Manili, the executive director of Fraternity Executives Association, I'm on the committee as well. Our chairman is Jeremy Slavinsky from Alpha Kappa Lambda Fraternity. And I'm assuming that the chairmanship will change and pass around. Some of the people on the committee are also former board members. Dr. Joseph Osenberg from Kappa Delta Rho, and Darlene Reyes from FIMU. So we have an experienced committee, and they know exactly what they need to be doing. Next steps, I'm often asked that. What's going to happen? Well, for one thing, now that we've gone to guidelines, we don't have to worry so much about getting it approved by the membership, nor do we have to worry about policy, because policy is that key word. Now it's guidelines. So these are, hey, you can do them, you don't have to, but that allows us to add definitions, which I'll note in a moment. Also, we can expand the FIPG manual and make that more practical, easier to work with. Definitions such as when is an event, we can add more details to the guidelines. We can include examples. We can provide some actual cases. We can say, to help our undergraduates, they always struggle with this. Sometimes they know what they're doing and they're just trying to evade, but other times they really don't understand the concept of an event. To them, it's a major deal with a lot of people. And when someone like me says, no, it can be just a few people, and it just depends on the circumstances, that's when they often stumble. So we can provide more help, more guidance with that. What's a BYOB? What's a six-pack? Over the years, interestingly enough to me, when FIPG first brought out the idea of a BYOB, bring your own, being a six-pack of 12-ounce beers, there was a significant amount of criticism from some university administrators who would point to studies that said binge drinking definition is 5 drinks, 5 beers. Why do you have 6? Why, you're violating the definition right there. And our response was, number one, when was the last time you went to an undergraduate event? Drinking 6 beers would be great. If we could hold it down to that, we're doing well. Secondly, that's how beer is sold. So it's very simple. That was why they selected 6 beers or a 4-pack of wine coolers. But we can add more definition. BYOB does not include bringing a bottle of vodka, bringing a water bottle that appears to be water but contains vodka, bringing a handle, bringing a case of beers. All of those are intended for consumption by other people. Bringing a keg, as I call it, a weapon of mass dissemination. Those are not BYOB situations. You're clearly intending to share that alcohol with a lot of other folks, and that violates the concept of the spirit of the FIPG policy. Third-party vendor, how do we define that? We're seeing more movement here, at least I am, as I visit and speak with undergraduates, and some of them are being more careful, and they're saying, we want to have a third-party vendor, Dave, what do we have to do? FIPG provides an outline and gives some guidance to that. But it's a smarter way to do it. It doesn't remove all liability from a chapter, for example, but it does help. It does share, and you do have that extra step in there of someone asking for ID and double checking. Women's groups that are using these and doing a good job with it are finding, I think, a much safer event. But those are the definitions that we can add into the policy now. The monitor system, which depending whether you're men's or women's groups tend to discourage or tell their women, you can't do this. Men's groups will use the monitor system. Now here I'm talking in a Panhellenic or interfraternal context of the monitoring teams that go out. We can add some language in there. For individual chapters, I often hear from the women and the men that they are using individual monitors. We can provide guidelines for that as well. Some things to think about. Biggest concern I have year in and year out is that the monitoring is left to those who have the least amount of social capital and the least amount of leadership experience in the chapters. Who am I talking about? Of course, the newest members. And they are not in a position to go up to a junior or a senior and say, hey, you gotta dial back. And that's the challenge. So if we're going to do monitors, these are some things to think about to have a safer event, as well as tips, training, things like that. There's a lot of different ways to go there, but the idea being with definition, we can add to that, and we don't have to worry about having that approved. Additional definitions that we can add to the FIPG guidelines. How do we define premises? This is popping up more often with firearms and drugs. We hear, well, we're not allowing firearms on the premises, which most people interpret as the actual house. But does premises include the parking lot where sometimes a young man may put a rifle in the trunk of his automobile, which is readily accessible? That's the concern. And how do we want to define this? Well, again, these are guidelines, but we can include language that says if you want to be confident, at least within the context of having a guideline, that the premises includes parking areas adjunct to or related to the actual property. I think that's smart. Specific mention of satellite or annex houses, which on campuses continue to be a greater concern. And we often see, when I work with men's fraternity national boards, I'll say, just out of curiosity, why aren't you starting chapters at community colleges? And of course I get a lot of harumph, and well, that wouldn't make sense. Why not? Well, they're only there for 2 years. And then I'll say, when was, I said, what have you got now? You've got men joining as freshmen, partying their brains out as sophomores, moving out of the house as juniors. I said, that's not the 4-year experience that some of us may have encountered when we were in school. And the annex or satellite houses are becoming ever more a means of avoiding risk management policies by having the parties there, under the mistaken assumption by the undergraduates that, yeah, all bets are off if we can get the event over to one of these places. And that's not true. Guest lists are, we can use examples. I'm seeing some real improvement here. I think some of the men's groups particularly have finally figured out that they don't have to have everyone over, and it's not a good idea. And there are certain things they can do to reduce their liability. The fact that when they graduate, they want to go out and look for a job. They don't want to have a criminal record, such as providing alcohol to minors. They don't want to have a civil litigation hanging over their head. That seems to be a motivator as well. So if we got that, then we have guest lists, which are prepared 24 hours in advance. You know exactly who's going to be there. If you aren't on the list, you don't get in. And that example, that sample, can be of great help. I've seen chapters doing a better job with that. And my advice to them is retain those for 5 years. Put them in a safe place somewhere and make sure you keep those. Because if I'm your lawyer, I wouldn't be, but if I was, and practicing law and defending you, the first thing I want to know is who was at the event, who can testify that things didn't happen the way the plaintiff did. So if you got a good guest list, you're way ahead. Another good reason why we can expand that. So we have a lot of work to do, that being the FIPG, Fraternity Executives Association Committee. Lots of things to add, and if you are on the call today and you would like to offer suggestions or say, hey, send Nikki or me an email and say, here's something I'm wondering about, or do you think the guidelines can incorporate this aspect? Fine, that's great. That's exactly what we can use that for, because we want to make this as good as possible. The enforcement of the policy remains the province and national organizations. From time to time, when I was on the board of FIPG or as policy interpreter or as administrator, I get the call, sometimes from a campus professional, who would say, who enforces FIPG on its own members? And I'd say, we don't. There is never has been a policy enforcement procedure in FIPG. The national organizations that joined said, we agree this will be our baseline policy, but that's up to the national organization to enforce the policy. So if you're looking for, if you will, an administrative hammer, FIPG has never served for that purpose. But the enforcement aspect continues to remain the province of the national organizations. And it's no secret that national organizations may vary in philosophy in terms of implementation of policies, in terms of holding chapters accountable. You and I know that's going to run along the spectrum. If you can use whatever 0 to 10, and you're going to have some organizations at a 9.5 in terms of enforcement, and some much the other way. One thing to keep in mind is that the executive director and his staff may not be making the policy decisions. Those may be coming from volunteers and on the board of directors, and those individuals may be saying to the exec, look, we don't want you to do whatever other organizations are doing. We think we should be this or that, whatever that might be. I'm not challenging that. I'm just pointing out that that's an explanation. Sometimes I talk to frustrated professionals, campus professionals, who say, Dave, we aren't getting anywhere with this particular group, and I'll say there may be one other angle that you haven't considered, and that may be that they're under some duress from a board member to remember that the executive has to report to the board of directors. And I certainly no secret, I had board members who considered themselves to be 47-year-old undergraduates. All they wanted to do was replicate their behavior and their good times, and they saw themselves as let's have a great time. By the way, I'm also a national officer mentality, and that's not going to help us, but that's where it goes. Host institutions, you also have that ability, and I see more and more institutions shifting the responsibility for enforcing policy away from the campus professional and to university or campus conduct folks, which I think is, it takes it off your plate. You can maintain a more neutral stance, in my opinion, as a campus professional, and you also have an opportunity there for input should the chapter be found accountable. But guidelines provide guides, so it's no longer a policy per se with FIPG, but with other organizations, at some point, if I'm on a jury, I'm looking for somebody's got to be able to say, you can't do this. And reiterating the point I made, resources, policy interpretation continues to be something that I do, and happy to help out at any time. Over the years, I've done a number of speakerphone calls where a campus professional say, Dave, can you speak with our entire IFC Executive Council? Sure. And I'll have them do their questions ahead of time. The email those to me. I'll run down through the questions so we don't call out anyone in particular or embarrass anyone. I'm not trying to do that. But I'll say, here are the questions I received, and these are the responses based upon FIPG guidelines or in the old days policy. And that seems to help. Sometimes they just need to hear a different voice. I do a lot of individual chapters. And occasionally get an alumna who says, hey, I'm struggling with this. Once in a while I get a staff member from one of the national organizations who says, how do you read this part of the policy? How do you interpret event? That type of thing. And can you give us some help? Happy to do all those things. That's a resource that we offer. We have the website and the manual via the FEA, Fraternity Executives Association. We have, we're going to be doing more programming at the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors annual meeting coming up in December of 17. We'll be applying and from there on, which I think is a good thing. Very popular over the last few years was a laminated copy of the policy, which was placed in everyone's welcome packet, if you will, and we hope to continue to do that as well. It's a good expense, if you will. It's justifiable, and it certainly seems to help folks, gives them a ready resource. Perspective one, FIPG guidelines have never been considered perfect, but no one else has advanced a better version. If, as I work with undergraduates, they'll, particularly with the men's groups, and when I talk with chapters, I tell them this is attorney-client privilege, and nothing you tell me will go beyond me. And I'll get some very candid answers and responses. And from time to time, the guy will stand up, who's probably the Joe Party guy, and he says, well, I just don't get this. I don't understand why we're doing these things, or this doesn't make sense. And I'll say, do you have a better way to protect yourselves? That's my standard default response. I'll say, I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying that it's enforceable up and down. I am saying that until we get something better, the policy or now the guidelines stand by themselves. It's a safe way to have an event. And there'll be some pushback there, but no one else has come up with anything like this. Many of the women's national organizations have a more restrictive policy than FIPG provides, which is fine. That's their call. And some of the men's groups have oriented towards, if you will, brought their organizations closer to FIPG, which is fine. It just depends on what you want to accomplish. But to me, never been considered perfect. It's not one size fits all, but it does give a base for understanding. The rhetorical question the board of directors for FIPG often asks itself is, where would we be if we did not have the guidelines, FIPG? What would we be doing? So the authors of the original policy, and I've never been able to track them down. I wish I could, but I give a lot of credit to the Executive Director Emeritus of Pi Kappa Phi Fraternity, Durward Owen, D-U-R-W-A-R-D, Owen. Durward was, we consider him the godfather or the father of FIPG. He led the charge. Pi Kappa Phi was instrumental in forming FIPG, and Durward was the president for a time of the board and did an excellent job in guiding. And he's one of those, he and I have had that conversation and talking about who helped to craft and so forth. And he was usually vague because he said it was really a compilation of ideas from a number of people. But the bottom line remains, where would we be if we didn't have these guidelines as a basis for consideration? Second perspective, you can sum up the entire set of guidelines in one word, and that is we care. If we care about our undergraduates, this is why we have the policies or the guidelines in place. It has litigation doesn't really matter at this point. We're talking about having safe events and having them in a safe in a manner that ideally everyone gets to go home that night and we don't have the tragedies, we don't have the inherent sadness, we don't have all the issues and problems. So caring is the key. Thought I'd share a few things as policy interp dude, and these are pretty typical. The three most frequently asked questions I receive as policy interp. Number one, and this is what they say, the men, usually not the women. How can we get around the policy? And I say, well, you can't. Welcome to life. But there's no way around. The policy's very well written, and I challenge them and I say, okay, find me a way that if you want to advance it, I'll give you the policy. You guys figure this out and come up with a way to get around the policy that still allows you to maintain your status as a chapter. And they usually give up and say there aren't any that we can see. That's right. It was very well written, and the additions to the policy have helped to further clarify. Number two is the definition of event. This is, again, where the men usually struggle with this because they just can't understand why they can't define something as an event. Sometimes the men's groups will take that upon themselves. My alma mater is Michigan State. At one time, their interfraternity council had a what they called a spontaneous social event exception to the risk management policy. And when I heard about it, I thought, you got to be kidding. Nope, there it was. And they had, if I think it was, and I'm guessing here, but I think it was if you have fewer than 30 people who get together spontaneously and alcohol is involved, it is not considered an event under the IFC regulations. So after throwing up, I said, yes, it is. I said, my real concern is you're going to have one of these and think you're safe, and you're not. Because if somebody gets hurt, worse yet, somebody dies, that lawsuit is going to come back against you and the other groups that are involved if that can be shown. And plaintiffs' attorneys are becoming ever more sophisticated in tracking down social media, all the electronic communications. Smart plaintiffs' attorneys are going to subpoena the hard drive off the president's laptop and others. They're going to get all that information. They're going to figure all that out. And, of course, most of that is going to lead to the conclusion this was a chapter event. You another way that I approach it and sharing with you today is I'll go around the room and say, what have you gained from your association with alpha, beta, gamma? And you hear some great stuff, don't you? And then you'll get group hugs, and that's terrific. And I say, yeah, there's an essence there that's important. What have you gained? Then after we're done with that, I'll say, what have you given up? And they'll say, well, we've given up time and money. I'll say there's one other thing. You gave up the right to set your own rules on risk management. I said, now those are being established by somebody else. So for all the good things you've gained, you give up some things. The right to, for example, to have a party at any time with 200 people and then call it a friends only. It doesn't work that way, because now you're wearing our letters, you're wearing our badge, you have to comply. And sometimes that helps them understand. They don't like it, and I don't blame them, but that's why we do things the way that we do. The third one is all Greekers, and that is, I see more of those these days, particularly after Greek week, and I don't know why that is. But I'll get the question sometimes in the campus professional. Dave, usually, not always, it's the men's groups who want to have an all Greek party with alcohol after Greek week to celebrate their Greekness. And I'll say, nope, can't be done. FIPG says very specifically in the manual that it's limited to 4, but I think if you contact the national organizations, you'll get a similar answer. And then, of course, there'll be some complaining. And would give me a chance to say, among other things, how are you going to compile a guest list? How will you put this together? But equally so, if I walked on your campus tomorrow and I went up to, did one of those random word association surveys, and I walked up to 10 people, are you a member of fraternity sorority? No. What do you think about when I say fraternity sorority Greek? And I will hear so often that alcohol, drunks, that kind of thing. I ask the students that, if you will, in my rhetorical or my metaphorical example. I'll say, what do you think they'd say? They'll call us drunks. They'll call us drinking alcohol. Right. So why is it that we're taking a single week when we celebrate being what we are, and then we have to have alcohol? That just takes away everything, all the good that we've just done. I try to get them to think philosophically about that. But all Greekers are fraught with liability, and the usual fallback these days is simply to dial up your national headquarters. I'd start with the women's and say, are your women allowed to take part in an open party with 3,000 of their best friends, or however many people they're going to be? And you usually get the answer that you're looking for. It's not the answer the undergraduates want, but it's one of those things you have to give up if you're going to have a safe event. Others, I also get the what if this, what if that. Students love to ask those, as always. And then the why can't we? And that's the same series of concepts of what if we have an event with this and this and this, and they throw in as many conditions as they can. And I can usually bring it back to one of the FIPG guidelines and say, well, that's addressed in this scenario. Oh, and then why can't we? Here are the reasons why. When I speak, I usually have 15 or 20 cases in my PowerPoint that I use, and the room usually gets quiet because I'm showing them real life. One of the examples came from an Ivy League school several years ago where one man, a sophomore, if memory serves, drove a beer truck to a big football game. And there was a U-Haul truck, and he had a number of kegs in the back on behalf of the chapter. And he claimed there was a mechanical problem. Not sure. That's pretty standard for people when there's a terrible accident. One way or the other, his truck struck another truck and killed a woman who was in I think her late 20s, early 30s, and injured another woman about the same age. So they, of course, sued. And one of the interesting aspects was, in that state, they named every single member of the chapter, even those there wasn't anyone else there at the time. They named every member of the chapter because, under that theory, the men had contributed money to the social fund. They knew the social fund would be used to purchase alcohol, and the alcohol was in that truck. And that was the catch that the plaintiff used to say, you are involved. I've seen that work in other states as well. Not all, but some. And it just depends on state law. But that extension usually gets their attention, and they think, and I say, you really don't want to put yourself in a situation. That's why we have these policies in place. We do not provide alcohol for that very reason. And lots of other cases out there, nearly all of them with sad endings, egregious injuries, some deaths, as you know, and never things we like to talk about. But I find that showing them, at least giving them a half dozen examples, tends to help them understand why these things are actually happening out there. With that, I would like to go to your questions. So as I understand it, you can, and Becky, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they can send those to you via the chat, and then we can go from there.
We see a couple questions coming in, so let us get those and send them over to Dave real quick.
Very good. I was hoping I didn't put everybody to sleep. First question is, what are ways to address violations? And depending upon whether that comes from a university or from a national organization, let me take those in inverse order. For a national, I would have a risk management, and we called it a risk management and standards committee. The staff would do the investigation once an incident had been brought to our attention. We'd gather the information, compile a report, get input from the undergraduates, and indeed offer them the opportunity to say, here's what we think ought to happen. We had acknowledged responsibility. Here's what we think ought to happen to us. And then give that over to the committee, which was composed of volunteers. And then the committee would make its decision. Sometimes they would agree with the staff rec, other times they wouldn't, which is fine. That's their purpose. But that was one way of processing it. So you didn't, I can also cite a couple of men's fraternities where the executive director and the staff make all those decisions on their own, and they're very quick to react. On the university side, in terms of addressing violations, I think if you have some input into that and you can gather the information, I think that's the first thing, is to bring the folks from the organization in, and that may be the leadership, with or without alumni, and say, okay, here's what we understand happened. We'd like a response from you, and then go from there and see what information can be gleaned. Some universities are saying, we're going to turn this over to student conduct in most cases, perhaps not all. In some cases, I've seen interfraternity, Panhellenic, other councils taking that role and actually doing the research. Either way, I think the keys are to have a standardized procedure that you follow, allow yourself plenty of time, stay within your guidelines in terms of how you conduct the investigation, and have a logical conclusion or outcome. Next one, how do most organizations monitor for compliance? It varies. Some rely upon the time-honored, you call them and say, hey, we've got a problem with your organization. If I was the exec, I would be instructing our consultants, there are certain things you look for, certain ways that chapters are going to try to use to get around the policies, and that's what you look for when you visit. It's not a perfect system, but you do your best. You educate, You encourage people to call in. Not every member of a chapter is going to be going to support non-compliance. Some of them think like 40-year-olds, if you will, and they're going to, if they have an opportunity to turn something in, then they will. I think I would place great emphasis upon anonymous reporting, and I've never had a problem with that. And getting the details so that you can say, yeah, is this what occurred? With risk management in general, that's usually not as big a concern. Hazing is the one thing that's more difficult it tends to exist in darkness and secrecy, and that's tougher to get out without allowing people to report that anonymously. What would be a good size for a guest list? We have brothers that throw any name possible. The list gets too large to effectively manage. I'm guessing that your national organization has a guest per member ratio, should have, and that is either 2 or 3 guests per member. If it gets above that, I think I agree with you, that would be way too big. I think if you have a 100-person chapter and you have 200 guests, that's 300 people total. Have a good time. But if you need more than that to have a good time, that I would challenge. But I think that having a limit on the guest list is just smart. And if you're, it's certainly the councils on a given campus, any of the councils or the university can establish a policy that says you may have no more than 3 guests per member or 2 guests per member, something like that, to keep it at a reasonable size. Some of the biggest major incidents that have occurred with wide-ranging destruction, issues with neighborhood friction, things like that, occur because there aren't any restrictions on the number of people. And when you're out on a Friday night, you're ramming around and you're just looking for something to do, then they're going to show up where the parties are. If you have a guest list, you're keeping people out. You can't come in unless your name's on the list. That makes life much easier. Next one, how to better explain the whys better if we don't have specific stories. I harvest those every day. I spend a lot of time. I'd be happy if you want to email me. I can share a couple of my PowerPoint presentations and be happy to share those with you. And ultimately, I hope that some of those are going to be on the FIPG website. That's a great question and something that I can work with Nikki Manili from FEA. We can actually post some of those stories. Maybe we redact the names of the organizations and so forth, because those really aren't important. What matters is the story itself. So those would be easy to do, and you've given me an idea, which is why I like doing these webinars. Next one, how have you seen campuses connect, both having and utilizing FIPG as a policy framework while still having a realistic conversation of what is happening? The issue, to ensure that events are safe, the issue I often hear is FIPG is too idealistic and not realistic to the campus culture we are dealing with. I'm going to agree halfway. I'm going to say that if we came up with a policy that reflected campus culture, we would probably revert back to kegs and allowing lots and lots of people to attend. The whole concept of FIPG was to make events safer. So you have an inherent conflict between culture, what people expect to be allowed to do, and policy, which is driven by incidents, problems, lawsuits, deaths, injuries, all those other things. And is there a safe space there somewhere in the middle? I'm not sure there is. I think that FIPG, again, is just guidelines. So you have an opportunity to frame those. And if you want to step forward and say, as I've seen some campuses doing now, saying we're going to allow you to give out beer because it's safer in a practical way, I think, to me, that would be the kind of decision that would resonate, at least in terms of safety at the end of the night, if you can maintain that. but I'm not sure that anyone is willing to tweak or torque the guidelines in FIPG to allow for example, more alcohol. The fact is 75%, give or take a few percentage points of our members are under the legal drinking age. That's also a factor. I would love to sit down sometime at a table with people and say, do we really need a 21-year-old drinking age? Do we really need that? Because that drives a lot of the litigation. But I can't speak for mothers and others against drunk driving and so forth. So they're obviously going to be heard from too. But just to have that conversation, I think would be valuable. Quick answer though to your question. I've been fast, but FIPG is not idealistic. It is realistic. It is pragmatic. This is how you have to, if you follow these, you're going to have a much safer event. I understand the idealism comes from the implementation, but that has never been a factor. It's been, if we don't set a high standard, if we allow people to do certain things such as roll out kegs or use chapter money to purchase alcohol and provide that, we're placing the undergraduates in a worse place than they would be without the rules entirely. So, and I'm not sure that's an entirely satisfactory answer for you, but it's how can we as campus professionals encourage our headquarter partners to adopt and enforce these guidelines and be good partners in reducing risk and holding chapters and members accountable? Great question. I think number one, you take good notes, and you, not from today, I mean you're tracking and monitoring things. We all have the stories, both sides of the equation. From the headquarters side, if we'd only known this was going on with our chapter, we would have done something. From the campus professional side, we've been telling you this for 3 years, and you don't return phone calls, you don't return emails, you don't let us know what you're doing, or you come in without our knowledge and take some action, but we never hear about it. I think if I'm a campus administrator, I'm thinking campus first. I want to protect my institution, my university, and by doing that, I want to keep track of what's going on. And if I find something that's of concern, I'm going to alert the appropriate people. I'm going to make sure there's a really bright paper trail. In other words, even though you may not use letters, you're alerting people at the national side, this is going on with your chapter. Now you can choose to ignore it, but this is what's happening. And let them know. At least if something terrible happens, you'll be able to say, I've got copies of 7 emails and letters that were sent to the headquarters of this assuming men's fraternity in the past 3 years and never received a response. And then it's on them to say, well, we just didn't react to it or something. But there has to be some ground in the middle there where the national headquarters also understand that we need to reach out from the national side and do that. It isn't always one-sided either. There are times when, from a national perspective, you aren't getting the information you're looking for, or the campus professional will massage things because, for example, I had one campus professional tell me, I didn't tell the staff, Dave, I didn't tell your consultant when he visited because you've got the IFC president. He's the best guy that's been doing that for 5 years, and I didn't want to put his chapter in jeopardy. Okay, it's an honest answer, but it's not the right one. So there's a yin and a yang there. Campus side, I would keep track and make sure that we are doing everything we can do to alert people and then taking whatever action that you feel is appropriate. How do you work with these guidelines regarding alumni events? FIPG has always been one size fits all in that regard. And the upside is with an alumnus event, alumni event, you normally don't have the issues because everybody's legal drinking age 21 or over, and arguably, theoretically, they're more mature in the way they approach the use of alcohol and they don't have as many issues. But FIPG, under the guidelines and policy, still applies to alumni events. Now, is anyone out there enforcing that? Most likely not. And then it's just a question of are they using the appropriate steps. To me, the smart thing is to do a third-party vendor. That eliminates a great deal of your risk. It's when you have people giving alcohol out that places even alumnus members in a very, very awkward position should something go wrong. What colleges or universities are the most compliant with FIPG guidelines and which are the worst? Good question. I'm not going to name the schools that I am certainly aware of some. There are at least a handful of universities that do not aggressively pursue risk management. They look the other way, and okay, that's their choice. Philosophically, I think that's where it's coming from. I'm not sure why the decisions are being made that way. I'm not sure about most compliant, but I do know that some of the universities I've been watching recently that have taken steps. I know that some time ago, Northwestern University had a third-party vendor system that was working very well. Purdue University's made some inroads the last couple of years in accepting the fact that they have certain issues and then saying, okay, what makes sense? What works with this? And then you ranging further to the south and to the west. There's a couple of other universities I can think of. Sometimes it varies year to year. Sometimes it depends on who is the campus professional who's leading the charge. But I do know that most of them do not use FIPG entirely. They will pluck certain aspects of it and then say, this is our policy. Whether they're compliant with that or not is another question. But I tend to go on, okay, where there are certain universities that generate a lot of negative publicity. They have a lot of incidents. They have, and by a lot I mean one or two a semester sometimes. They have high-profile situations that occur. There are others you rarely hear from. And those are the ones that you say either they're doing a very good job with risk management or they just aren't getting the publicity. But the thing I look for is the work hard, play hard mentality. If you hear that, that is as good a signal as any that that university will be, there will be some incidents there because the entitlement sense comes in. When teaching FIPG, how do you go about explaining the whys rather than giving them stories about what happens if they do something bad? How do we make it more proactive? I've done a couple presentations called the whys, WHYS, of risk management, and the short answer is I'd be happy to share those. If you want to email me, I'd be happy to share those PowerPoints with you. What I like to do is give them a set of facts, say that this is going to happen, and then say, tell me what is safer. Or I say, this happened, now let's do a post-mortem, if you will. Let's go back in time. Where were the bad choices made and then why? And get them thinking philosophically. For example, if there's there was a death several years ago of a young man at a chapter of a men's fraternity, which these kinds of things happen, gosh, 2-3 times a year. Parties all day, parties into the night, brothers don't do anything, they acknowledge he's been drinking heavily, they just leave him alone or they put him to bed or what have you, and he never wakes up, he aspirates. So I like to ask the undergraduates in terms of the whys. I say, what's the real issue in this chapter? And the easy answer is, well, they should have taken him to the hospital. Got that? Yep. But drill deeper here. Why didn't they? And that's where you get into the why. we have these policies in place. Why didn't these men react? Was it because they were fearful of being criticized? Was it because you never give up a bro? Was it because they didn't want the chapter to theoretically get into trouble for having a drunk member? What was it? And that's where I try to get them to think. If we had taken steps, followed policy, then the why would no longer be an issue here. You'd understand why we have these things in place. And that sometimes helps them. A lot of people like to do this crime scene investigation, the CSI concept. That's what I try to use. But I think it's tougher to get our young people these days to think in those terms, because their standard response is just tell us what to do. I say this, dig deeper with me. Let's look into the culture of this group, and then you understand why FIPG has a policy on this, or why you have a moral obligation to step in and do something. You don't want to let this happen, and we don't want to be in the headlines. And that's an interesting experience this year. I won't share anything about the organization or the campus, but I was working with a men's chapter, and they had some issues with social media. And I said, well, I was talking with the officers, and I said, there were a number of them, and I said, okay, when this surfaced, why didn't someone do something? And what I heard was, well, the guy that did it is a member of this pledge class by the Greek letter designation. And the rest of us, most of us are in this pledge class, an older pledge class. Therefore, it was up to his pledge class to sanction him. And I just rolled my eyes at that one and said, are you kidding? Whatever happened to? And I tried to bring him back around. Not sure if I did. But one more example of the fracturing of a chapter, and that's something else I would focus in on, is whose responsibility is it? That's why we have that. But I would be happy to share those PowerPoints I've got on the whys of risk management and walk you through those. How do you feel about a wristband system for guests? Is it effective as a guest list? You would use that in conjunction with a guest list. It would be a guest list, then you get your wristband, or some chapters use felt tip markers and mark the guest's wrist in a certain way, or mark the back of the left hand or the right hand, something like that. But I would use those in conjunction. The bottom line is you don't want people showing up and then walking into your event where you don't know them. And they're bringing with them, they may bring with them some baggage. Maybe they had a bad week. Maybe they have been drinking heavily all day. That becomes your responsibility if you're hosting the event. That's why you have a guest list. How do you enforce these rules with a chapter when the university does not fully enforce the guidelines? I'm not sure whether this is an undergraduate, alumnus, or campus professional. All I can say, or staff member, but all I can say is that you do it because it's the right thing to do. And if the campus, the university, has not fully enforced the guidelines, that's their call. But that doesn't mean you have to go to that level, that lower level. I would still do my very best to enforce the guidelines. And for those of you who say, Dave, if we do that, it's social suicide. Okay, then let's get all the presidents together. I think you'll find when you get people to sit down and think things through together, we can accomplish a great deal in terms of risk management, particularly the women's presidents who are keenly aware of the discrepancy or the fact that they're being brought over. Every time they go to a party, to use athletic metaphor, it's an away game. They're not being able to do that in their own houses if they have houses. And they're aware of that. I'm seeing more and more women, undergraduate women, speak up via the campus paper and otherwise and say, we need to change the way we have these social events. Okay, good for you. I'm glad you're speaking up. Those are the people that I would get to that meeting and say, if we follow the rules, we don't want this to impact our members, but we also need to get everyone else working with us. And if I haven't said it before, risk management applies both genders. We have to have that help. Are there any resources on venue, specific guidelines, open parks, bodies of water, group camping types of event? Yes, there are, and I think most of the national organizations hit those. There is some good language I saw recently from one of the former FIPG member organizations that covers that. I will add boxing tournaments, which scare the heck out of me, even though they're for a good cause. And most of the men's fraternities prohibit chapters from hosting those, but they do not prohibit individual members from participating in them. But you're talking about some potential concussion injuries and worse that I've seen just in my lifetime with those types of things. The having events in a venue where you have water, where you have boats, pontoon boats, Lake Shasta out in California, Oregon, I believe, was a good example where year after year finally became such an issue that I believe there was a concerted effort both by the national organizations and by the universities to step in and say, we just aren't going to take this risk anymore. It's still a concern. I'm not sure if it still is, but it's a good example. Camping trips, pretty tough to control those. Depends on how you define camping and where you're going and what you're doing. But if the fact that it's away from campus doesn't mean that the risk management doesn't apply. So if it's just members, that's one thing. If you have members and guests, that's quite another in terms of how do you get bartending companies to understand FIPG. I think you sit down, show them the policy, and say, if you have questions, we've got people who can interpret this for you. But that's a great question in the context of encouraging bartending companies to, that makes it so much safer for you as undergraduates to allow them to use bartenders. That doesn't take all the liability away, but it's much safer. And in that context, I'm not sure where the issue is, but if there is an issue there's certain people who can help with that. And Becky, looks like that's all the questions. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dave. It looks like we're at the end of our time, and that was our final question for today's AdvanceU program. I wanted to just extend a huge thank you to you for taking time out of your week to spend time with us. It's really been fascinating, I know for me, to learn about the history and the future of FIPG. So thank you to all of our attendees for your participation and offering great questions. And we hope you learned some new ideas and practices today that will help you improve your work. We would also like to thank the generous support of Zeta Tau Alpha for making AdvanceU program possible. Following today's session, all webinar participants will receive an email with a program evaluation for today's session. So we hope that you take the time to provide us with your feedback. The recording of today's session will be posted within about 2 weeks on the AFA site. Be on the lookout for information about the AdvanceU webinar in March. And thank you again to Dave for his session this afternoon and for you all as participants. We hope you continue to be willing to think differently and work differently through learning about new ideas and topics by joining us again for AdvanceU. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.